This is my true story. For 22 years, my son made my tea every morning with 2 sugars and milk in the same china cup. It was our daily ritual, and I thought it showed he still cared about me. But last Tuesday, I came downstairs early and saw him pouring something into my teacup from a small bottle. He stirred it carefully and smiled to himself before placing the cup on the table. My hands started shaking as I realized what I was seeing. Before I tell you what happened next, tell us where you are watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear my story. Every morning for 22 years, my son prepared my tea exactly the way I liked it and brought it to me in the same china cup his grandmother had given me before she died. The cup was special because it had belonged to my mother and she had used it every day of her life. When she passed away, she left it to me, and I treasured it as one of my most precious possessions. My son knew how much that cup meant to me, and he always made sure to use it when he prepared my morning tea. He would wake up before me and go to the kitchen and boil water and prepare the tea with 2 sugars and a splash of milk. Then he would bring it to me wherever I was sitting and place it in front of me with a small nod. We did not talk much during these moments, but I appreciated the gesture. In a household where my son was often cold and distant, this daily ritual felt like a connection between us. It felt like proof that somewhere deep down he still cared about his father, even if he did not show it in other ways. The routine never changed in all those years. Every single morning without fail, he would make the tea and I would drink it. It became such a normal part of my life that I stopped thinking about it. I just expected the tea to be there when I came downstairs or when I woke up in my chair. I trusted it completely because it came from my son and because we had been doing this for over 2 decades. I never questioned what was in the tea or how he made it. I just drank it and felt grateful for this small act of care. I believed this ritual proved that beneath his coldness, there was still love for me. My son had become distant over the years, especially after his mother died. He stopped hugging me or saying he loved me or showing affection in any obvious way. He became focused on money and success, and he seemed irritated by my presence most of the time. But every morning he still made my tea, and I held on to that as evidence that he had not completely stopped caring about me. I told myself that making tea for someone every day for 22 years was an act of love, even if he did not say the words. I told myself that he was just not good at expressing emotions, but that the tea ritual showed his true feelings. I needed to believe this because he was my only child, and I could not accept that he might not love me at all. The tea became a symbol of our relationship and proof that we still had a bond, even if it was fragile and mostly silent. Looking back now, I realize how desperate I was for any sign of affection from him. I was clinging to this one small gesture and building an entire narrative around it. I was interpreting his actions in the most generous possible way because I needed to believe my son loved me. I ignored all the other signs that he was cold and calculating and possibly dangerous. I ignored the way he talked about my house and my money. I ignored the way he seemed impatient for me to die so he could inherit everything. The tea ritual blinded me to the truth about who my son had become. I was so focused on this one act of apparent kindness that I missed everything else. I missed the way he looked at me sometimes with barely concealed contempt. I missed the way he talked about me to his friends like I was a burden he had to endure. I missed the way he was always asking about my will and my estate planning. I missed all the warning signs because I wanted to believe the tea meant he still loved me. For 22 years, I drank that tea every morning and felt grateful and loved. For 22 years, I trusted my son completely and never questioned what he was giving me. For 22 years, I was blind to what was really happening. And then one Tuesday morning, I came downstairs earlier than usual, and I saw something that shattered everything I believed about my son and our relationship. Last Tuesday, I woke up about 30 minutes earlier than usual because I had not slept well the night before. I got out of bed and put on my robe and slippers and headed downstairs toward the kitchen. Normally, my son would already have my tea ready and waiting for me by the time I came down, but today I was early. I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, and I assumed he was just starting to prepare my tea. I walked quietly down the hallway toward the kitchen, thinking I would say good morning and maybe sit with him while he finished making it. I reached the kitchen doorway, and I paused there without announcing myself because I heard the sound of something being poured. I looked into the kitchen and saw my son standing at the counter with his back to me. He was leaning over my china teacup with intense concentration. In his right hand he was holding a small brown pill bottle, and he was shaking something out of it into the cup. I watched in frozen horror as white powder fell from the bottle into the dark tea. My heart stopped, and I could not breathe or move or think. I stood there in the doorway, watching my son crush pills into powder over my teacup with focused precision. He was using the back of a spoon to grind the pills into fine powder, and then he was stirring it carefully into the tea. He tested the color by holding the cup up to the light and looking at it closely. Then he smiled with satisfaction, like he was pleased with his work. My own son was poisoning me. I felt like I was watching a scene from a nightmare, and I kept hoping I would wake up. I kept thinking there had to be some other explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe the pills were vitamins or supplements he was adding to my tea to help my health. Maybe he was trying to help me and I was misunderstanding what was happening. But the way he was being so secretive and careful told me this was not about helping me. The way he smiled when he looked at the poisoned tea told me everything I needed to know. I watched him dump the pill bottle into the trash can under the sink. Then he took a paper towel and wiped down the counter where he had been working to remove any trace of powder. He wiped the spoon clean and put it back in the drawer. He arranged my teacup on the table in its usual spot with careful staging to make everything look normal. He was humming quietly to himself while he did all of this. He was humming while preparing to murder his father. My mind was racing, trying to understand what I was seeing and why this was happening. I thought about my house, which was worth about $3 million. I thought about my will, which left everything to my son as my only heir. I thought about how my son had been asking me recently about my health and whether I had any problems with my heart or my blood pressure. I thought about conversations where he seemed to be calculating how much longer I might live. Everything clicked into place with terrible clarity. My son was trying to kill me so he could inherit my estate. He had been planning this for who knows how long. He had been stockpiling pills and figuring out the right dosage and waiting for the perfect time. And he had been using our sacred morning tea ritual as the method of delivery. The one thing I thought proved he still loved me was actually the weapon he was using to murder me. The betrayal was so complete and so devastating I could barely process it. I realized I was still standing in the doorway and that if he turned around he would see me and know that I had witnessed what he did. My phone was in the pocket of my robe and my hands were trembling as I slowly reached for it. I pulled it out as quietly as I could and I opened the camera app and switched it to video mode. I pointed the phone through the doorway and I started recording everything I was seeing. I needed evidence. I needed proof of what my son was doing because nobody would believe this without seeing it themselves. I stood in the doorway with my phone recording and I captured everything. I recorded him picking up the trash can and pulling out the pill bottle he had just thrown away. I zoomed in on the label and I could see it was a prescription bottle with his name on it. The medication was a strong sedative that doctors prescribe for severe anxiety and sleep problems. A few pills of that medication could make someone very drowsy. An entire bottle crushed into powder and dissolved in tea could kill someone, especially someone my age with a weak heart. I kept recording as he examined the bottle and seemed to be calculating something in his head. Then he put the bottle back in the trash and covered it with paper towels so it would not be visible if someone looked in the garbage. He was being so careful to hide the evidence. He was thinking through every detail to make sure he would not get caught. This was not an impulsive act or a moment of rage. This was premeditated and calculated murder. I recorded him wiping down the counter one more time with a clean cloth. I recorded him checking the teacup to make sure the powder had dissolved completely and was not visible. I recorded him arranging everything on the table to look exactly the way it looked every other morning. He even adjusted the placement of my newspaper and my reading glasses to make the scene look natural. He was staging my death to look like I had simply died peacefully while drinking my morning tea. The video on my phone showed everything clearly. You could see his face and his hands and the pill bottle and the teacup. You could see him being methodical and careful. You could see him humming while he worked. The video was about 2 minutes long and it captured undeniable proof that my son was trying to poison me. I stopped recording, and I slipped my phone back into my pocket with my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I realized this had probably been going on for longer than just today. I thought about all the mornings over the past few weeks when I had felt unusually tired after drinking my tea. I thought about the days when I felt dizzy or confused, and I had blamed it on my age. I thought about how my doctor had commented that some of my symptoms did not match any known condition, and maybe it was just stress. My son had probably been giving me small doses of poison for weeks or maybe months to make me gradually weaker. He was building up to this final lethal dose that would kill me. He was probably planning to call an ambulance and act shocked and devastated when they arrived. He would tell them I had been having health problems and that I had seemed weak lately. The doctors would assume I died of natural causes related to my age and my heart. Nobody would question it because old men die of heart failure all the time. My son would inherit my $3 million mansion, and nobody would suspect he had murdered me for it. The cruelty of using our morning tea ritual as his murder weapon made me feel sick. For 22 years, I had treasured those moments as proof of his love. I had held on to that daily gesture as evidence that my son still cared about me despite everything else. And all along, he had been planning to use that exact ritual to kill me. He had turned the one thing that made me feel connected to him into an instrument of death. I thought about how many times he must have fantasized about this moment. How many mornings he must have made my tea and thought about adding poison to it. How many times he must have smiled at me and handed me the cup while imagining me drinking it and dying. The person I thought I knew was completely gone. My son was a stranger capable of killing his own father for money and smiling while doing it. I had to make a decision quickly about what to do next. I could confront him immediately and demand to know why he was trying to kill me. But he might lie or deny it, or even try to hurt me in some other way. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to survive, and I needed to make sure he faced consequences for what he was trying to do. I slipped my phone back into my pocket with the video safely recorded, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had to act completely normal and pretend I had not seen anything. If my son suspected that I knew what he had done, he might panic and try something more direct and violent. I needed to play along and make him think his plan was working. I stepped back from the doorway and made noise with my footsteps so he would hear me coming. Then I walked into the kitchen, acting like I had just come downstairs. I said, "Good morning, son," in the most normal voice I could manage, even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. He jumped slightly when he heard my voice, and he turned around quickly. For a split second, I saw something dark flash across his face, but then it was replaced by a smile. It was that warm, fake smile I had mistaken for love so many times over the years. Now that I knew what he really was, the smile looked sinister and hollow. He said, "Morning, Dad," and his voice sounded cheerful and casual. He gestured toward the table where my poisoned teacup sat waiting for me. He said, "Your tea is ready just the way you like it." I looked at the cup sitting there in its usual spot, and I felt rage and grief rising in my throat. That cup had belonged to my mother. It was one of my most treasured possessions, and my son had chosen to use it as the vessel for my murder. The symbolism of that felt like another layer of cruelty. I forced myself to smile and say thank you. I walked over to the table, and I sat down in my usual chair. My son stayed in the kitchen watching me, and I could see anticipation in his eyes. He was waiting for me to drink the tea. He was waiting for the poison to start working. He was excited to watch me die. I picked up the newspaper from the table, and I pretended to read the front page while I thought about what to do next. I needed to get rid of the poisoned tea without him knowing, and I needed to do it in a way that looked natural. I turned slightly in my chair, so my back was toward him for just a moment. I said something about needing to check the weather, and I stood up and walked to the counter near the sink. I positioned myself so that my body blocked his view of what I was doing. I picked up my teacup, and in one quick motion, I poured the poisoned tea down the sink and turned on the water to wash it away. I grabbed an identical cup from the cabinet that matched my china cup perfectly. We had a full set that my mother had left me, and the cups all looked the same. I filled the new cup with fresh water from the tap, and I added a tea bag from the container on the counter. I did all of this in about 10 seconds while keeping my body between my son and the sink so he could not see what I was doing. Then I turned around, holding the cup of plain tea, and I walked back to the table. I sat down across from him, and I raised the safe cup to my lips while maintaining eye contact with him. I said, "You make the best tea, son," and I took a small sip of the clean water with the tea bag in it. It did not taste anything like the tea he usually made, but he would not know that. I watched his face as I drank, and I saw hope dancing in his eyes. He thought I was drinking the poison. He thought his plan was working. He thought in a few minutes I would start feeling sick, and then I would collapse and die, and he would be rich. I kept drinking the safe tea slowly while he watched. I could see him trying not to smile. I could see excitement building in his expression. He was barely containing his joy at the thought of me dying. This was the son I had raised and loved and sacrificed everything for. This was the boy I had held as a baby and protected and provided for. And he was thrilled at the prospect of watching me die. I continued drinking the clean tea while having a normal conversation with my son about his plans for the day. He told me he had some meetings and errands to run and that he would be gone most of the afternoon. I nodded and pretended to care about his schedule while my mind was racing with plans of my own. I finished the cup of tea and set it down on the table. My son was watching me carefully, looking for signs that the poison was starting to work. I could see disappointment in his eyes when I seemed perfectly fine. I stood up from the table and said I was going to take a shower and get dressed for the day. My son nodded and said he would clean up the kitchen before he left. I walked out of the room and headed upstairs to my bedroom. As soon as I was out of his sight, I pulled out my phone and looked at the video I had recorded. It was clear and damning. You could see everything he had done. You could see his face and the pill bottle, and him stirring poison into my tea. This was enough evidence to have him arrested and convicted. I sat on my bed trying to decide what to do next. I could call the police right now and show them the video and have my son arrested immediately. But part of me wanted to see how far he would go. I wanted to see what he would do when he thought I was dying from the poison he gave me. I wanted to see if there was any chance he would feel remorse or panic and try to save me. I needed to know if there was any humanity left in him at all, or if he was completely gone. I decided to pretend the poison was working. I would stage my own death and watch how my son reacted. If he tried to help me or called for an ambulance, then maybe there was some small part of him that still cared. But if he just watched me die, or seemed happy about it, then I would know for certain that my son was a monster. I would know that the boy I raised was completely dead, and only this cruel stranger remained. I sent a text message to the emergency services with my address and a brief explanation of what was happening. I told them I had evidence of attempted murder, and that they needed to come to my house immediately, but to wait outside until I signaled them. I attached the video to the message so they could see what my son had done. I told them I was going to pretend to be poisoned to see how my son reacted, and that I needed them to be ready to intervene. The police responded quickly, saying they had received my message and the video and that units were being dispatched to my location. They told me to be careful and not to put myself in danger. They said they would park down the street and wait for my signal. I felt relieved knowing help was close by, but I also felt terrified about what I was about to do. I was about to confront the reality of who my son had become, and I was not sure I was ready for that truth. I went into my bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I barely recognized the old man staring back at me. I looked tired and sad and broken. I thought about all the years I had spent loving my son and providing for him and believing he would take care of me when I got old. I thought about how wrong I had been about everything. I had raised a son who was willing to murder me for money, and that failure felt like it was crushing me. I took a deep breath and told myself I had to do this. I had to know the truth. I had to see what my son would do when he thought I was dying. I walked out of my bedroom and headed back downstairs toward the kitchen where my son was still cleaning up. It was time to see if there was any love left in him at all, or if greed had destroyed every good thing I had tried to teach him. I walked slowly back into the kitchen where my son was washing dishes at the sink. About 20 minutes had passed since I drank the fake tea, and I figured that was enough time for poison to start working if it had been real. I stood in the doorway for a moment watching him, and then I started my performance. I grabbed the door frame and made a gasping sound like I was having trouble breathing. My son turned around and looked at me, and I saw his eyes light up with interest. I stumbled forward, clutching my chest and making choking noises. I said I do not feel well, and my voice came out weak and strained. My son did not move to help me. He just stood there watching, with his hands still wet from the dishwater. I took another step, and then I let my legs buckle beneath me. I fell to the kitchen floor in what I hoped looked like a realistic collapse. I landed on my side, and I lay there with my eyes half closed, making gasping sounds like I was struggling to breathe. I heard my son's footsteps approaching, and I felt him kneel down next to me. But he was not checking my pulse or trying to help me breathe. He was leaning close to my face, watching to see if I was really dying. I could feel his breath on my skin, and I could sense him studying me with cold, clinical interest. He was not panicking or calling for help. He was just observing me like I was an experiment he was conducting. I let my breathing become more shallow and irregular. I made my body go limp, and I let my eyes roll back slightly. I wanted him to think I was at the very edge of death. I wanted to see what he would do in this moment when he thought he was about to get everything he wanted. Through my barely open eyes, I could see his face hovering above me, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. He was smiling. Not a worried smile or a nervous smile, but a genuine smile of satisfaction and relief. I watched in horror as that smile spread across his face while he looked down at his father dying on the kitchen floor. Then I heard him whisper something under his breath. He said, finally. That single word told me everything I needed to know about who my son had become. He had been waiting for this. He had been impatient for me to die. And now that it was happening, he was happy. Then he did something even worse. He laughed. It was a quiet sound, almost like a sigh of relief, but it was definitely a laugh. He was laughing while his father lay dying at his feet. He actually found joy in this moment. I felt tears forming in my eyes, but I kept them from falling because I did not want to break character. I needed him to believe I was dying. I needed to see how far his cruelty would go. He stood up and walked away from me. I heard him moving around the kitchen, and I wondered if he was finally going to call for help. But instead, I heard him opening cabinets and drawers. He was not calling an ambulance. He was not trying to save me. He was doing something else. I heard the sound of glass clinking and liquid being poured. He was making himself a drink. My son was celebrating my death with a drink while I lay on the floor struggling to breathe. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening to him move around the kitchen, acting like everything was normal. He was humming again that same tune he had been humming while he poisoned my tea. He was happy. He was relieved. He was free. In his mind, his burden was finally dying, and soon he would inherit everything, and his life would be so much better without me in it. I heard sirens in the distance getting closer. The police were coming just like I had asked them to. It was almost time to end this performance and reveal the truth. But I wanted to give my son one more moment to show me who he really was. I wanted to give him one last chance to do the right thing. The sirens got louder and closer until they were right outside our house. I heard car doors slamming and heavy footsteps on the front porch. Then there was loud pounding on the front door. The police were announcing themselves, saying, "This is the police, open the door immediately." My son's humming stopped abruptly, and I heard him set down his glass with a sharp clink. He said "what the hell" under his breath, and his voice was filled with confusion and panic. He walked quickly toward the front door, and I could hear the fear in his footsteps. He was not expecting the police. He thought I would die quietly, and he would call an ambulance later and play the grieving son. But now, police were at his door, pounding and demanding entry, and he had no idea why they were there. I heard him unlock the door and open it. I heard deep voices asking if he was my son and telling him they needed to come inside immediately. My son asked what this was about and why the police were here. One of the officers said they had received a report of a medical emergency and possible criminal activity at this address. My son's voice went up an octave, and he said there was no emergency and everything was fine. But the officers pushed past him and entered the house. I heard them asking where I was, and my son said his father was upstairs resting. The officer said they had information that I was in distress and they needed to see me right away. My son led them toward the kitchen where I was still lying on the floor. I heard their footsteps approaching and I knew it was time. The officers entered the kitchen and I heard one of them say, "There he is on the floor." They rushed over to me and knelt down, checking my vital signs. My son was standing in the doorway saying he had no idea I had collapsed and that I had been fine just a few minutes ago. He was already building his lie and preparing his performance as the shocked, innocent son. One of the officers was checking my pulse and asking me if I could hear him. I decided it was time to end the charade. I opened my eyes fully and I looked directly at the officer. I said, "I can hear you perfectly, and I am fine." The officer looked confused and asked if I was the one who called them. I said, "Yes, I called you because my son tried to poison me this morning." I sat up slowly with the officer's help, and I looked across the room at my son. His face had gone completely white, like all the blood had drained out of his body. His mouth was hanging open, and his eyes were wide with shock. He looked like he had seen a ghost. I said, "Hello, son," and my voice was quiet but steady. I said, "I switched the cups. I did not drink the poison you put in my tea. I poured it down the sink and drank clean water instead." His legs seemed to give out, and he grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. He started stammering, trying to form words, but nothing coherent came out. He said, "You were dying, and I saw you collapse, and you were not breathing." I said I was acting. I wanted to see what you would do when you thought I was dying. I wanted to see if you would try to save me, or if you would just watch me die. And now I know the answer. You smiled and you laughed and you made yourself a drink while your father was dying on the floor. The officers were looking back and forth between me and my son, trying to understand what was happening. One of them asked me to explain what I meant about poison. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and I said I have video evidence of my son crushing pills and mixing them into my tea this morning. I said he has been planning to murder me so he can inherit my estate. The officer took my phone and I showed him how to access the video I had recorded. The officers gathered around the phone and played the video I had recorded that morning. I watched their faces change as they saw what my son had done. The video showed everything clearly. It showed my son standing at the kitchen counter with the pill bottle in his hand. It showed him shaking pills out of the bottle and crushing them into powder. It showed him stirring the powder into my teacup with careful precision. It showed him testing the color of the tea and smiling when he was satisfied. It showed him throwing the pill bottle in the trash and wiping down the counter to hide the evidence. One of the officers asked if he could send the video to his device for evidence, and I said yes. He used his phone to make a copy of the video, and then he handed my phone back to me. The other officer walked over to my son, who was still standing in the doorway looking like he might faint. The officer said, "We need you to come with us downtown for questioning." My son shook his head violently and said, "This is a misunderstanding," and his father was confused and did not know what he was talking about. The officer said the video evidence was very clear and showed premeditated attempt to poison his father. My son started to cry and said no, that was not what it looked like. He said he was just adding vitamins to my tea to help my health. The officer asked him why he would throw the vitamin bottle in the trash and wipe down the counter if he was just trying to help me. My son had no answer for that. He just stood there crying and shaking his head. One of the officers went to the trash can under the sink and pulled out the pill bottle my son had thrown away. The officer put on latex gloves and held the bottle up to read the label. He said, "This is a prescription for high-dose sedatives prescribed to you 3 months ago." He asked my son why he was putting sedatives in his father's tea. My son said he was not, and that the bottle must have ended up in the trash by accident. The officer said the video clearly showed him deliberately putting pills from this bottle into the tea. The officer opened the bottle and looked inside. He said this bottle was prescribed with 90 pills, and there are only about 10 pills left. He asked my son where the other 80 pills went. My son said he had been taking them for his anxiety and insomnia over the past 3 months. The officer said the dosage on the label was 1 pill per day as needed, which meant he should have about 60 pills left if he had been taking them as prescribed. My son had no explanation for the missing pills. The officer bagged the pill bottle as evidence and called for a detective to come to the house. He said this was now officially being investigated as attempted murder. My son's legs finally gave out completely, and he collapsed into a chair. He put his face in his hands and started sobbing. He kept saying this could not be happening, and that it was all a mistake. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. A detective arrived about 20 minutes later and reviewed the video on the officer's phone. The detective said this was clear footage of premeditated murder. He said you can see the defendant crushing pills and stirring them into his father's tea. You can see him disposing of evidence and staging the scene. You can see him being methodical and careful, which shows planning and intent. The detective said this was not a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated murder for financial gain. The detective asked me about my estate and whether my son was the beneficiary. I said yes, my house was worth about $3 million, and my will left everything to my son as my only heir. The detective nodded and said that established clear motive. He said my son stood to gain millions from my death, and the video showed he was willing to kill me to get that money. The detective said based on the evidence they were placing my son under arrest for attempted murder. The detective read my son his rights, while another officer put handcuffs on his wrists. My son was still crying and saying this was not supposed to happen and that everything had gone wrong. He was not denying what he had done anymore. He was just devastated that he had been caught. The officers lifted him to his feet and started walking him toward the front door. I stood up from where I had been sitting, and I walked over to where they had stopped near the doorway. For the first time since the police arrived, my son looked directly at me. His face was wet with tears, and his eyes were red and swollen. But I did not see remorse in his expression. I did not see guilt or shame about what he had tried to do. I saw confusion and maybe a hint of regret, but not the kind of regret that comes from hurting someone you love. It was the regret of someone who had made a tactical error and gotten caught. He looked at me like I had betrayed him by surviving and calling the police instead of dying quietly like I was supposed to. I looked at my son standing there in handcuffs, and I felt my heart breaking into pieces. This was the baby I had held in my arms. This was the child I had raised and loved and sacrificed everything for. This was the boy who had once hugged me and told me I was the best dad in the world. And now he was being arrested for trying to murder me. I needed to understand how we had gotten to this point. I needed to know what had gone so wrong. I asked him why. My voice broke on that single word, and I felt tears running down my face. I said, "What did I do wrong as your father?" I said, "I gave you everything I had and I loved you with my whole heart, so why did you want to kill me? What did I do to make you hate me so much that you would poison me?" My son just stared at the floor and said nothing. The officers waited quietly, giving him a chance to respond. I kept asking him to tell me what I had done to deserve this. I said if I failed you as a father, I need to know how. I said if I hurt you or neglected you or did something that made you feel unloved, then please tell me so I can understand. But he would not answer. He just stood there looking at the ground with tears dripping off his chin. The silence stretched out and became unbearable. I realized he was not going to give me an answer because he did not have one that would make sense. The truth was, I had not done anything to deserve this. I had been a good father. I had loved him and provided for him and been there for him his whole life. His decision to poison me had nothing to do with anything I had done or failed to do. It had everything to do with greed and selfishness and a complete lack of empathy. He wanted my money and my house, and he was willing to kill me to get it. It was that simple and that horrible. The detective said they needed to take him downtown for processing. The officers started walking my son toward the door, and I followed them. At the doorway, my son finally spoke. He said, "I am sorry, Dad," and his voice was barely a whisper. But the apology felt hollow and meaningless. He was not sorry for trying to kill me. He was sorry he got caught. He was sorry his plan failed, and now he would face consequences instead of inheriting millions. I watched them put my son in the back of a police car. I watched the car drive away, taking him to jail where he would be charged with attempted murder. I stood on my front porch watching until the car disappeared around the corner. Then I went back inside and sat down at my kitchen table. The china teacup was still sitting there where I had left it that morning. I picked it up and looked at it, and I thought about how my son had chosen to use my mother's precious cup as the instrument of my death. I set it down, and I put my head in my hands, and I cried harder than I had cried in my entire life. The mansion sits empty now except for me and the crushing silence that fills every room. The house feels too big and too quiet without another person living here, even though that other person was trying to kill me. I walk through the halls and I see reminders of my son everywhere, his childhood pictures on the walls, his awards and diplomas from school, the furniture he helped me pick out. Every corner of this house holds memories of the life we shared and the relationship I thought we had. Now all those memories are poisoned, just like the tea he made for me. I make my own tea every morning now in that same china cup that belonged to my mother. I cannot bring myself to throw the cup away, even though my son used it to try to murder me. It was my mother's, and it is precious to me, despite what happened. But every time I drink from it, the tea tastes like ashes and betrayal. I sit at the kitchen table in the same spot where I sat that terrible morning, and I think about how my son smiled while watching me die. The memory haunts me every single day. My son is serving 30 years in prison for attempted murder. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury took less than 3 hours to find him guilty. The video evidence was too clear and too damning for any other verdict. His lawyer tried to argue that he had been temporarily insane or that he had not really intended to kill me, but the prosecution showed that he had been stockpiling pills for months and that he had researched lethal doses online. They proved this was premeditated and calculated murder for financial gain. The judge gave him the maximum sentence. I visit him sometimes at the prison, even though I do not know why I keep going. I sit across from him with bulletproof glass between us, and I pick up the phone to talk to him. I search his face looking for the boy I raised. I look for any sign of remorse or understanding of what he did. I look for evidence that somewhere inside him there is still a piece of my son who loved me. But I never see it. He never appears. The person on the other side of the glass is a stranger who happens to look like my son. During our visits, he talks about the appeal his lawyer is filing. He talks about how the sentence was too harsh and how he might get out earlier for good behavior. He talks about what he will do when he is released and whether I will let him live in the house again. He seems to think that eventually things will go back to normal between us. He does not understand that he destroyed our relationship forever when he put poison in my tea. He does not understand that I will never trust him again and that I can never look at him the same way. I loved him with everything I had. I gave him my whole heart and my whole life. I worked hard to provide for him, and I sacrificed my own happiness to make sure he had opportunities. I raised him to be a good person with values and empathy and love. But somewhere along the way, I failed completely because he grew up to be someone who could smile while watching his father die. He repaid my love with poison and betrayal. Now I am alive, but I am alone. I have my house and my money and my health. But I have no family and no one who loves me. I spend my days rattling around in this big empty mansion wondering which is worse. Dying from the poison my son gave me, or living with the knowledge of what he tried to do. Some days, I think death would have been easier because at least I would have died still believing my son loved me. Instead, I have to live every day knowing the truth about who he really is and what I meant to him. For 22 years, my son made my morning tea. The day I discovered he had poisoned it, I switched cups and called the police. He smiled watching me die. Then I opened my eyes, and his life ended instead. But mine ended too in a different way. Now I am alive but alone, wondering which fate is crueler.